I'd like to welcome Gil here. We've been teaching together for 35 years now. Yeah, long time. And actually, he's one of my closest friends. And I'm thrilled to have him here in Nevada City, where you were up here when we were doing construction on this, right? That's the last time you saw it. And it's changed a little. So have we all. So anyway, I'm just so happy to have him here. And, I think it's a great boon to our culture and our community that's actually very dedicated to Dharma practice. So this is a raw, joyful occasion. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I'm delighted to be here and to have come to see in the center its full glory yesterday in a way I haven't seen before. It was pretty special. And and if I had a capacity to be envious, I would have had envy. It's pretty special here, and it's a very special community. I was a little bit daunted when I saw the flyer for this event. I didn't realize it was going to be called a retreat, which they kind of like the ups the something, and then this happy fundraiser. So so yeah, just being together with John will be happy. And but John and I have gotten in trouble with being a little bit too happy. We especially some of these retreats we've taught together, and there was way too much laughter coming out of the teacher room that some of the retreatants actually complained. And that seemed odd. This is a path to happiness, and that should include laughter.
It should.
And first met John in '89. We started a teacher training together in December of 1989. And then a few years later, we drove, he picked me up, maybe in Davis, where 2 years later, something in Davis, my partner was going to school there and I was visiting, and he came down from Nevada City, picked me up, and we drove all the way down to Yucca Valley for a retreat down there as teacher trainees. And we talked the whole way down in John's little Toyota pickup truck.
76 Toyota pickup.
And we mostly talked about practice and our practice experiences, and we both kind of got high. It was kind of like a contact high, of sharing Dharma and everything. And by the end of that trip, John was my brother. We were very close, and it's been really special. And it's also been very special for both of us to have these parallel tracks, starting with sitting groups, and the sitting groups growing, and then you know, and then for years, John wanted to have a center, and there's all kinds of conspiracies and plans and property being bought and sold and different things. It's kind of sidetracked everything and went along, and then at some point, this developed, and I developed, um, part of developing IMC in Redwood City, and I feel like there's a real kinship or a real sibling relationship between our two centers, and also the fact that we're both very much community based. Community is very, very important for Buddhist practice to um, to navigate and negotiate your own practice and the community practice at the same time. It makes everything much richer. It makes practicing living in community better, makes living practicing for yourself better. But they all kind of feed in each other, and they grow together. So you have that here, and it's quite a remarkable achievement. that is here. And some of it has to do because of these wonderful volunteers over the years who was helping and plugging in, and that John kind of gathered around John to help make this happen and grow and make it possible. And so I just delighted to be here and to be with all of you and to be with John. And so we kind of, Adam and I talked a little bit about what to do here today. And and I kind of didn't understand it was 3 hours either. so 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 we'll partly just make it up.
Yes.
Which both John and I are kind of, for better or for worse, what we do. And but I did suggest to Adam that I do a little teaching. Adam thought we should do some meditation. I don't know what he's thinking. And so I see, am I still here? And then we'll see where we go from there. And probably there'd be some time together, and maybe we can have questions and discussions that you can have with Paul and with John and I, and so we'll see where we go. Thank you for being here. And and with both of our centers very much founded on this principle of generosity and volunteerism, and so one of the features of that is that
You still there?
anything. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
That one, I'm going to try to talk and then leave it alone. So am I on now?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe if I don't touch it.
That's
And so one of the characteristics of IMC and the whole donation culture that we have, we call it a generosity culture. A couple of things. One is that I try to get this same system of offering retreats and Dharma for free for a retreat that I taught at Tassajara, the Zen monastery, where the Zen Center doesn't have that culture. They charge for what they do. So a couple of years ago, I did a Dana retreat, freely given retreat there. And with the idea of trying to show the people at Zen Center how wonderful they can be. And in the course of that, what I discovered was that they had no idea what it meant. They thought it just meant offer it for free. And that's not what it means. It means offering it in a culture of generosity. And I hadn't thought about this before, but we've developed a culture at IMC with all these little details, all these different ways of understanding ourselves and ways things work that are all kind of sharing to create a culture that's based on generosity. But I hadn't been able to, I didn't understand that until I went to Tassajara and saw they didn't have it in the same way. There's a culture of generosity there too, but the way they would support offering teachings and practice opportunities freely, they didn't have that. And so then I came back from there, and then I even wrote a little article about the IMC's culture of generosity that kind of supposed to try to encompass what we have. But one of the features of that is that uh, I never ask for money down there. Um, so even our fundraising letters, if you read it carefully, there's never an ask. It looks like it's an ask. It sounds like, it smells like an ask. It has a remit envelope, it looks like a fundraising letter. So of course it's an ask, but actually there's never an ask. So we don't do it there. But when I come to someone else's center here, I can ask. Then I can champion it. So this is a fundraiser. So finally I'm set free. And now I can encourage you to support Mountain Stream. And I'll touch on more about that, but I'm really delighted that this is the purpose of this. And I get to kind of be, not be so reserved. And so I'll offer a little teaching, that's the things that I'm often teaching these days. And then have a little sitting and take it from there. Is that okay with everyone? Does anyone have anything they want to feel like need to say before we go on? It'd be nice to have this interactive a little bit.
Yes.
And online, thank you very much for being here. What you don't, but I'm kind of sometimes very conscious of the camera that you're behind up there. So if I look down here, this is where your your tiles are, but I know you're up there behind there. So thank you very much for being part of this as well. It's
Yeah.
actually the fact there's more of you online than there is in this room here is very meaningful. It's kind of inspiring. And so thank you for being part of this. So the little piece of teaching is that I've been inspired by lately is that the language, the metaphors, the approach the Buddha had for teaching what in English we call practice was not by using the word practice. We English people in America, like we use the word practice all the time. Practice this, practice that. I'm practicing Buddhism. Are you practicing Buddhism? What practice do you do? Yeah, I'm practicing. And we don't really sometimes look deeply. What do we mean by this word that we're always using? Practice, practice, practice. And Robert Thurman, who's a great Tibetan teacher, he was famous for saying these Western Buddhists, they keep saying practice, practice, practice. When's the performance? And uh, and so we did in Vipassana, we do a lot of practice. In Zen, it's only performance. There's a whole way Zen is understood. But but practice. And if you ask someone, what's your practice? Maybe you say, I do Vipassana, I do Metta, I do Zazen, I do Dzogchen. And often it's kind of like a technique that's talked about. And often it's the center of gravity for that tends to be meditation. What's your practice? Many people will reply meditation. So there's no really good word in Pali, the ancient language of the Buddha, for the English word practice. However, it is when translators translate, sometimes they're translating the word bhavana. And some of you might have heard the word bhavana. There's a bhavana society in, in Virginia, West Virginia, I think, that one of the most famous Theravada monks, Bhante Gunaratana, lives there still. He's an old man now. And, and so the word bhavana means to grow, to cultivate, like a gardener that cultivates the plants. And and if you translate as practice, you get American Buddhism. But what if we translate it as to grow, and we ask you not what you practice, but what are you growing? What would you reply then? Would some of you would be stumped? And some of you would probably become reflective. Oh, no one's ever asked me that. What am I growing? What has grown over these years? Growing? What does that mean? How does that work? And but in fact, we are growing. We are developing the metaphors that Buddha used for this growing and practice are natural, very natural references, like growing a plant, growing a tree. Um, the there's seeds we have, and those seeds germinate. They grow and become trees. The trees flower, and realization in their teaching to the Buddha was literally called the fruit. So it's the culmination of this thing that's growing, and it's kind of explicit in the Buddha's teachings that uh, that the contrast that we're trying to avoid is to manufacture something, to be engineer and to kind of put things together artificially, to create things that don't exist in the natural world by themselves, that are a product of human, certainly creativity, imagination, constructs of the mind, that are often the source of a lot of our suffering. And so what we don't want to do is to practice as one more construct, one more engineering task, one more putting, Buddhism by the numbers, put all these things together and put everything in place, and then somehow, boom, you'll have this perfect edifice of a Buddhist that will just crumble and die, which has no life in it. Living systems grow, they shift and they change, they die and get reborn. And so, what we're growing inside is a living system. It's a natural capacity. And what we're, in the language of the Buddha, just maybe people in the West are not so happy to hear this, but we're here to destroy, to deconstruct the artificial constructions we built. And one of the most powerful metaphors that exists in a poem that's supposed to be what the poem the Buddha exclaimed the night of his awakening. He said, "House builder, you have been seen. Your rafters and beams have been destroyed, never to be rebuilt again." So it's unfortunate because John used to build a house and a contractor, and that to use, that metaphor, we can't stretch it too far. But here the example is that a house doesn't exist in the natural world by itself. It's something that the human mind creates and imagines and puts together. That's something that's the constructed world of self-identity, self-conceit, this whole world that we get caught in and we build up over a lifetime. That is being dismantled. But it's not leaving us with nothing unless you think that's everything. What is leaving us with what can grow. And what can grow, the Buddha calls wholesome. The wholesome, kusala, sometimes it's called skillful. And I love the English word wholesome because it means, in my mind, it's part of the whole. And so the idea is not to construct something apart from the whole, but to let something grow into the whole. Let the whole grow. And so it grows and grows. And it's a natural process. I'll say a few more words and then I'll stop. So these metaphors, a natural process of metaphor. One metaphor the Buddha used for this growth is that of a chicken sitting on her eggs. If the chicken sits on the eggs and incubates them, keeps them warm, does the right thing with them, those eggs will grow. And the Buddha says, more or less said, that chicken can sit on the eggs and have the thought, may these eggs never hatch. But if she does everything right sitting on them, those eggs will hatch. In the same way, if we do our growing, our practice, our cultivation well, we sit on our eggs, even if we don't want to be enlightened. No. Isn't that remarkable? It's a natural process. And finally, the source is awake. Source is the right way, but when he was sitting under the night of his awakening, he reflected and contemplated some questions about the source. And and he tended to his experience in a way that brought forth the beautiful, wholesome qualities, the seven factors of awakening: mindfulness, investigation, energy, joy, tranquility, samadhi, and equanimity. And both of these, his deep capacity for contemplation and thinking that kind of cleared the deck and opened his mind to see clearly, and these beautiful qualities that evolved at that night of his awakening, he said they all have their source. They're all based on the yoni self, based on yoniso manasikara is the word. Manasikara means kind of, I translate as contemplation or consideration. Bhikkhu translates as attention. And yoniso Bhikkhu translates as careful attention. I like caring attention. But the word literally means of the womb, of the womb. That the practice that grows from something that's comparable to a woman's womb, the source of human life. And we don't construct our embryos. We don't like get out the manual and screwdrivers and do all the things. We can't. But there's this amazing natural process that's probably pretty elaborate, sophisticated, and awesome that we have. We can, all of you went through that process. It's amazing that you're here today. Thank you. And so that what's growing in the Dharma comes from this profound place inside that is distinct from the surface mind that's constructing things and making things up and that we can live in. And so one of the things we're doing in this Dharma practice is learning how to relax and settle enough and to trust enough that we don't have to be in charge. We're not making something up. We're not making the practice. We're not, in some ways, not responsible for the practice in terms of making it happen. We're responsible in a sense. We have the honor, we have the privilege, we have the great joy to support the practice, to bring something profound within us, to bring it forth, let it grow, let it develop, and let it fill us. And that's the language the Buddha used repeatedly, was to be filled with the wholesome, to be filled with goodness. For all the letting go that Buddhism emphasizes, it equally emphasizes becoming filled by growing kindness, goodwill, compassion, joy, happiness, collectedness, honesty, truthfulness. There's all these beautiful qualities that want to come out from this deep place within. So, profound care, profound consideration, profound attention that has no tension in it. Tension belongs to the surface mind that's caught up in construction and making things. So with that as an introduction, let's meditate a little bit, and I'll offer a few words of guidance in the beginning. You're probably familiar with the idea of relaxing at the beginning of a meditation session, softening the tension in the body and mind. And one of the purposes of that is to free ourselves up from the constrictions that interfere with us dropping deep inside and making room for the inner growth, making room for something that wants to grow. And you might start by, in the most matter-of-fact, unconflicted way, maybe a loving way, notice any way that you have tension Any way in which you feel stress or feel tight, holding in your muscles. And as if knowing and seeing it is a form of love. Just see where you hold your attention. Maybe letting your attention roam around. Caringly notice, where is their attention? And then as you exhale, if gently, don't do the relaxing. Allow for relaxation. Don't be ambitious that it's going to be big relaxation. Just a softening of the body, a softening of the thinking mind, a softening of the heart. And if your ordinary thinking, planning, remembering is more surface activity, can you feel your way into your inner life? Can you feel your way deep inside to a place of quiet, to a place that feels at the center of all things in your life? Maybe some place that feels calm, tender, and tenderly breathing with that inner depth. Low, relaxing into your depths within, letting go of your thoughts. And at the same time, letting go into your depths. The idea that you want to stay close to your depths inside, to incubate, to keep that area warm and safe. this deep incubation of the Dharma. Oh, and unfold. Quieting your thoughts so you can better feel your inner depth, as if feeling it, sensing it, like the body of the chicken keeping the eggs warm. And then with the idea that the Dharma practice is about what is going to grow in you, What's going to be born in you? Ask you a question. What if question? Think the answer. Think about the answer. Maybe something will arise spontaneously. Maybe there's a feeling that responds or body sensation. See what happens when you hear this question. Sitting here quietly, sensing and feeling yourself deeply. What wants to be born? Beneath all the challenges and difficulties of life, in this Dharma practice, now, what wants to grow in you? And how can you nourish birth and growth of the Dharma in you? Thank you.
Reflecting on these possibilities of understandings. What came up for me is three words: patience, silence, and love. Simple, but it's really what this is. The heart of this is simplicity. It is something of, as Gil was saying, it's not something we manufacture. It's really something we are, and our capacity to quiet ourselves and listen to what it is that's underneath the kind of the life in our chatter. We're so good at that. We tell such great stories, about everything. And the truth is, it goes back to how do we allow this incredible happiness that is actually quite apparent when we turn our attention towards what is it that I'm feeling, you know, and can we name it, you know, and once we name it, then it has a possibility of becoming part of our psyche and our way of looking at the world. So much of the time we put on these glasses and these glasses, we shade them. I think they're, Polaroid or something. There's some way of shading what we see and what the world is. And the practice is our ability to eliminate or move um, outside those parameters. And that's why I say patience and silence and love. Simple, you know. But probably the patience is a huge piece for me. I'm kind of your, what is it, ADHD, a restless uh, human being who keeps going, I got to go to you know, another peak somewhere, whether it's Mount Fuji or Kailash or Annapurna, whatever. Uh, I have to go. And in a sense, it's been a wonderful teaching. At the same time, what am I trying to accomplish? And I realized nothing. I'm not trying to accomplish anything, but there is this thing about, oh, there is a peak to the mountain, and there is that we all, in some sense, have a, a inner calling to go to, if we can use the term, top of the mountain of somehow. And yet, we're already there from this point of view, already at the top of the mountain. And what's lovely about this is, and I'm so grateful to have Gil here. He has been such a great friend all these years and supportive. And and he qualifies those things, patience, silence, and love. It's really simple. And yet, because I know for myself that internal restlessness is something I constantly deal with. It's kind of my life of looking at options, realizing that if I just would listen, uh, stay silent, then they would show themselves. Otherwise, there's this manufacturing going on about somehow how I'm going to make my life or your life better, you know? And this is saying, oh, it's already better. And that's really where this word happiness is, there's happiness based on the sensual pleasure of things. And there's also a deep happiness that is the ability to hold all things. And I'm trying to go towards this thing that holds all things. You are this grand, grand creature that has manifested here as maybe a little chicken, but you have manifested. And at this point, um, you have to get, who are you? It's a big question. Who are you? You know, and I can't answer that for you, but you have to ask yourself that because in essence, we're looking at something that has not something we're manufacturing. It's something that's already present. And what's already present is marvelous. It is, you are the gift. You don't have to say a gift to the world, but it is true, but a gift to yourself. You know, you've spent all these years, first of all, confusing yourself, and then coming to these practice saying, I have to somehow uh, undo that and go somewhere else. And I've been good about going somewhere else. But, I've also been here a lot. And I'm so happy that we can be together and understand this quality of Sangha, and this coming together like this is what it's about, because when we come together, it's not one heart, one mind, one body. It's this multiple being that's in essence manifesting itself. You don't have to. In some ways, it's interesting because I always thought I had to get enlightenment instead of saying, "Oh, I am enlightened." And how am I going to deal with this if I actually hold that position? And I definitely am into holding that position. It's all here. You've been it the whole time. So anyway, I'm just babbling. I like to babble. So that's the thing about teachers. So let's see. Should we take a little break here, or what would you like to say?
Yeah, maybe break in a few minutes, but I don't exactly want you to have turn to babble because that doesn't.
Well, that'll be.
But I wonder if some of you would like to share some of the things that responses to what wants to be born, what wants to grow. What can you do to nourish that growth? What came up for you in some simple words?
You can raise your hand. I'll bring a mic to
Vivian
you.
there.
So hear you online. And if you're online, just raise your hand and Robin will find you.
Humility was what came up for me. And a recognition that for whatever reason, I have held humans as like, and not felt compassionate towards human beings very much. And so I was sitting there and I could feel myself irritated that there were noises and people are here and where's my cave and stuff. And then you asked that, I was feeling that, and then you asked that question, I was like, oh, what's really being pointed to from the irritation is that it's like clouds covering over humility and how important that is. And I could feel it saying, I really want to grow. And so,
very nice. And as you said that, I felt something that prompts me to ask you, is there anything sweet about humility?
Sweet about people, you're saying?
There's sweet about humility.
Oh, humility. Yes. There's a tenderness, there's a harmlessness, there's a calm, there's beauty. It's
Wow. So all those things are your eggs. Let them grow. Thank you. Over here?
Yeah, hand raised online.
Okay,
yeah, Julie.
Julie, if you'd like to unmute.
First of all, thank you, John and Gil. I can't imagine a better pair of teachers.
I can't hear enough.
Yeah, it's very low online, so I don't know if you can turn it up, Robin.
How is that?
That's
Julie?
better, yeah.
Can you hear me better?
Yeah, but lean forward closer to the mic.
I'll bring myself closer to my mic. Is that any better?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, thank you, John. Thank you, Gil. I can't imagine a better a duo of teachers to cultivate with this morning. What showed up for me this morning in the discussion of growing through practice is being able to live according to my unique expression of being amidst a world, that often wants things, wants us to conform. So, learning to really live in accordance with my unique expression.
Very nice. Thank
Mm.
you. And I know you enough to know that your unique expression is marvelous.
Thank you. I've had good teachers.
So we have someone in here. And your name is?
Hi, Rolita, and thank you. This is my first time hearing you in person, so thank you. Thank you, John. So what comes to me is shedding. And in my time meditating over the last few years, I have, in the silence, I have shed a lot of tears. I have shed a lot of pain. And it comes from 65 years of building what I thought I was supposed to be. It comes from 65 years of building what I thought I am supposed to be and what I'm told I'm supposed to be. And what I realize in the silence that I'm none of that. And the hard part is letting go of that. But in the process, I'm learning to be what I need to be. And I know I'm saying I'm learning to just be. And it's a roller coaster because as I shed what I'm not, I feel so much, my existence feels so more at peace. And so I've learned that shedding is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing over time. So that's what I get from this.
Beautiful. I love hearing that. And sometimes, maybe I implied this earlier, that sometimes you hear a lot in Buddhism about shedding, letting go, as if that's the final story. You're supposed to be left with nothing. Kind of is true, but kind of it's very much not. Because when you really shed thoroughly, your beauty comes forth. And maybe there's more beauty waiting for you than you realize.
All right, how about Steve online? Just unmute yourself and go.
Okay. Yeah, I'm struck in listening to you that the biggest obstacle for me is in the area of selfing and this manufacturing self that is always trying to construct something better. And I realize that a word that you brought up, enlightenment, is within the realm of that manufacturing self. And a better word that came to me was maybe shifting from enlightenment or enlightening to enlivening, which is
Enlivening?
enlivening. Yes,
Enlivening.
Enlivening.
right.
Oh, nice.
Which, is a given.
Ah, very nice. I love it. And I couldn't help myself but that's not original to me, but to switch because you talked about the selfing, the whole selfing thing and manufacturing self, that instead of it being enlightened, many of us do well by just lightening up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hold it really close.
Hi, I'm Alexandra. It's great, wonderful to be here. Long time. What came up for me was gratitude. You know what? I want to continue to grow. I have a great forgetter. I have a really great forgetter, and I am filled with gratitude. So much of the time, but not all the time. Much of the time, I forget about a lot of things. And then my wanting mind starts roaming about the universe, wanting this, wanting that. And then I forget about how grateful I am for all I have and for all that I don't have, which is equally important. So that's what came up for me. Thank you.
It's great.
Those are profound understandings, that you understand yourself that way. Thank you. So maybe one more from online.
Right, Patricia, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, you two. I'm just so struck how touched I am just sitting with both of you who were probably one of my very first meditation teachers together at Land of Medicine Buddha. And I remember then I couldn't feel much of anything. That was probably what brought me into the whole practice. And I'm just so sitting here almost crying, and I'm going, that is what happened to me over these years, is this growing of this heart and this cultivating. When you said cultivating, Gil, and I went, yeah, I've been cultivating compassion and love through the practice for 35 or 40 years. And I didn't realize how much of it's there until I'm just sitting here with you two now and going back to this place of just remembering how I had this feeling in my heart and I didn't know what it was. And I asked one of you what it was. And you said it was compassion. And I went, oh my God, I didn't even know that that was a feeling that is actually, different than just day-to-day being. And I just appreciate the practice and you two so much for that. So I just wanted to thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely to hear. And one of the marvelous things that I saw in retrospect through my own practice was that while I was busy doing things in practice and making things, trying to get concentrated or whatever I was trying to do, try to get enlightened, and luckily, the Dharma or my inner life had other ideas, and that only in retrospect did I realize Dharma practice that I was doing. I thought I was doing one thing, but my heart was doing something else, and slowly I was growing. And these inner qualities were developing, getting stronger. And I didn't even know they were there, but they were kind of first on the edges and then more in the center until they became obvious to me. But I didn't know that they were growing. And so let's see, maybe it shouldn't stay close to me.
It's the little.
I'm friendly with everything, but some things I don't want to get too close to, apparently. And one of the very nutrients for this inner growth is our sincerity in our practice. Practice sincerely, and you might be a little bit off in your practice, and that's okay. Sincere in one. So thank you. So maybe this is a good point to pause, take a break, and I think of today as a day to strengthen and develop and support the Mountain Stream community. And the huge part of that is not, it's a fundraiser, and a fundraiser, but it's not just offering donations to support Mountain Stream, but also to contribute to the sense of community here. So some of you might prefer just to be quiet during this time, but this is really a wonderful time to also say hello to each other, say hello to those of you who don't know, and we'll take half an hour, which is kind of a long time, and so use the time well, and if you use it well, let's see what grows in half an hour in this community life that we have. Thank you. So we'll start in here at 10:45.